Music swelled through the grand ballroom of the Pierre, masking the lethal tension beneath diamond chandeliers. A lone sniper waited in the dark. One perfectly placed shot could topple New York's most feared empire. Yet survival didn't come from armed guards, but from the unlikeliest woman in the room. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a masterclass in gilded deception. Beneath the painted ceilings and cascading crystal chandeliers, New York's elite mingled with the city's most dangerous predators. It was the annual Children's Hope Charity Gala, a highly publicized event that served as a convenient, heavily guarded neutral ground for the East Coast syndicates. Eleanor Fitzgerald stood near a towering marble pillar, a flute of vintage Krug champagne resting loosely in her hand. She was the forensic accountant for the Mercer Syndicate, a woman whose brilliant mind untangled the labyrinthine offshore accounts and shell companies that kept the organization afloat. She was also a woman who commanded space. Eleanor was fat, and she carried her weight with an undeniable, unapologetic, regal grace. Her custom-made emerald silk gown draped flawlessly over her broad hips and thick thighs, the deep green fabric contrasting sharply with her pale skin and auburn hair. While the size 0 socialites flitted around the room like nervous birds, Eleanor stood, grounded, an immovable force of calm observation. She preferred the periphery. From here she could see everything. Her dark eyes tracked across the room, past the mayor, past the police commissioner, who was laughing a little too loudly, until they landed on her employer. Jonathan Mercer. Jonathan was the undisputed head of the syndicate. At 38, he possessed a cold, terrifying charisma that commanded absolute obedience. Tonight he wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo that accentuated his broad shoulders and lethal posture. He was standing near the towering French doors that opened out onto the terrace, deep in conversation with his head of security, Richard Davies. Something was wrong. Eleanor's mind was built to recognize patterns, and the pattern in front of her was completely off. Richard, a man who usually hovered over Jonathan like an anxious hawk, was subtly angling his body away from his boss. Richard's hand kept brushing the side of his jacket, tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against his hip. More alarmingly, the perimeter guards near the terrace, usually a dense wall of muscle, had thinned out. There was a glaring 30-foot gap in the sightline between Jonathan and the dark glass of the doors. Eleanor took a sip of her champagne, her heart rate beginning to climb. Why would Richard leave the boss exposed to the terrace windows? She glanced at the heavy glass panes. The night outside was pitch black, a sharp contrast to the brilliant illumination of the ballroom. Then she saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of light on the glass. It was faint, swallowed instantly by the reflections of the chandeliers, but Eleanor had spent enough time poring over security footage and assassination reports to know exactly what it was. A laser sight. Someone was across the street, positioned high in the neighboring luxury apartments, aiming directly into the ballroom. She tracked the invisible trajectory from the window to the floor. The beam was moving. It swept past a silver champagne bucket, glinted off a socialite's diamond necklace, and began climbing the tailored pant leg of Jonathan Mercer. There was no time to scream. Shouting would cause a panic, and a sudden stampede would give the sniper the split second needed to pull the trigger before Jonathan could be secured. The guards were too far away. Richard was actively looking in the opposite direction. Eleanor slammed her champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray and moved. For a woman of her size, she moved with shocking, terrifying speed. She didn't run. Running would draw the eye. Instead, she glided across the polished parquet floor with aggressive purpose, intercepting the space between Jonathan and the terrace doors. The orchestra shifted seamlessly into Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2, a sweeping, dramatic piece that swelled through the cavernous room. Jonathan turned his sharp, icy blue eyes, narrowing in irritation, as a figure abruptly entered his personal space. He opened his mouth to dismiss whoever was foolish enough to interrupt him, but the words died in his throat. Eleanor didn't ask for permission. She crashed into him, her soft, substantial curves pressing firmly against the rigid, muscular wall of his chest. Her right hand clamped onto his left shoulder with a grip like a steel vice, while her left hand caught his right, forcing his arm up into a ballroom frame. Jonathan's body instantly went rigid with lethal intent. His free hand twitched toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. "Dance as my husband. There's a red dot on your forehead," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hiss against his jaw. Jonathan froze. The sheer audacity of her action, combined with the chilling weight of her words, short-circuited his violent reflexes. He was a survivor, above all else. He didn't look toward the window. He didn't flinch. His eyes simply locked onto hers, dark and calculating. "Lead," he murmured back, his voice a dangerous rumble. Eleanor stepped backward, pulling him with her. "Keep your posture straight. Move into the turn. If we stop, you die." They swept onto the dance floor, a striking, unconventional pair, cutting through the sea of pastel dresses and dark suits. Eleanor's emerald skirt flared around her calves, a brilliant splash of color, as she forcefully steered the most dangerous man in New York away from the kill zone. 3 o'clock. Terrace doors, Eleanor murmured, her lips fixed in a polite, brilliant smile for the benefit of the onlookers. "Sniper. High elevation. The trajectory was aiming right for the space between your eyes." Jonathan smoothly took control of the frame, his hand resting firmly on the thick, warm curve of her waist. Despite the adrenaline spiking through his veins, he noted the solid, comforting pressure of her body against his. There was nothing fragile about her. She was an anchor in the sudden chaos. "Who?" Jonathan asked, his smile equally fake, his eyes scanning the crowd over her shoulder as they executed a sharp pivot. "I don't know who is holding the rifle," Eleanor replied, her breath slightly elevated from the exertion and the terror. "But I know who opened the door for them. It's Richard." Jonathan's grip on her waist tightened painfully. "Watch your accusations, Eleanor. Richard has been with the syndicate for 15 years. And for the last 6 months, he's been embezzling from the Cayman offshore accounts." Eleanor countered, flawlessly anticipating his pushback. They spun past a table of oblivious hedge fund managers. "I found the discrepancies 3 days ago. $4.2 million heavily obscured through dummy tech corporations. I was building the full dossier to present to you tomorrow. He must have realized the audit was closing in." Jonathan's jaw locked. The betrayal stung, a cold venom seeping into his chest. He looked past Eleanor's auburn hair and spotted Richard standing near the north exit. The security chief was staring at them, his face pale, his hand gripping a two-way radio. Richard hadn't expected Jonathan to suddenly take to the dance floor with the syndicate's accountant. The moving target had ruined the shot. He cleared the terrace guards. Jonathan stated the realization, solidifying into a quiet, deadly rage. "Yes," Eleanor said, keeping the waltz perfectly on tempo. "And right now he is trying to figure out how to reset the board. We are completely exposed out here, Jonathan. We need a blind spot." "The grand staircase," Jonathan murmured, leaning in close. The intoxicating scent of her perfume, something dark, woody, and expensive, filled his senses. "If we can make it behind the sweeping curve of the stairs, the marble will block the line of sight from the windows. From there, the service elevators." "We can't just sprint," Eleanor warned, her hand squeezing his shoulder. "If Richard realizes we know he'll order his loyalists in the room to open fire, there are at least 3 of his men stationed at the exits." "Then we dance." Jonathan said, his eyes dropping to meet hers. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Really looked at her. He knew Eleanor Fitzgerald as a genius, with numbers a quiet fixture in the boardroom, who drank black coffee and destroyed rival companies' financial structures with a few keystrokes. But here in his arms she was breathtaking. Her plush lips were parted, her chest heaving against his, her dark eyes entirely devoid of the fear that usually plagued those in his presence. She was magnificent, and she was currently the only thing keeping him breathing. The orchestra hit a sweeping crescendo. "Dip me," Eleanor commanded suddenly. "What? The laser, it's back." "Drop." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He hooked his arm firmly around her waist, bracing his legs, and dipped her deeply toward the floor just as they spun. A faint, terrible zip cut through the air, completely masked by the crash of the orchestra's cymbals. A crystal flute on a nearby table violently shattered into sparkling dust. A few guests nearby gasped, looking around in confusion at the broken glass, assuming a clumsy waiter had dropped it. Jonathan pulled Eleanor back up his heart, hammering against his ribs. It was too close. The sniper was getting impatient, taking shots on the move. "They missed!" Eleanor gasped, clutching his lapels, her emerald dress rustling loudly. "They won't miss twice," Jonathan growled. He abandoned the traditional waltz steps, forcing a much faster, aggressive tempo that dragged them rapidly toward the edge of the ballroom. "You hold on to me, Eleanor. Do you understand? Do not let go. I'm not planning on dying in a size 20 dress surrounded by hedge fund managers, Jonathan." She shot back, a spark of fierce, terrifying humor in her eyes. "Keep moving." They hit the edge of the dance floor. The massive, sweeping curve of the grand marble staircase loomed 10 feet away. Across the room, Richard Davies raised his two-way radio to his mouth, his eyes locked dead onto Jonathan. He was giving the order. The silent assassination had failed. It was time for the loud one. Jonathan saw 3 men in dark suits break away from the perimeter, their hands sliding beneath their jackets, walking briskly toward the staircase. "Eleanor," Jonathan said, his voice dropping all pretense of aristocratic charm. The street-bred, ruthless boss of the syndicate bled through. "When we get behind that marble, you take off your heels and you run for the kitchens. You don't stop for anyone." "I am not leaving you." She snapped her nails, digging into his suit jacket. "You don't know the access codes to the service corridors. I changed them yesterday during the security patch. You need me." Jonathan let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You're a terrifying woman, Fitzgerald." "I'm an accountant mercer. I always balance the books." With a final violent spin, Jonathan practically threw them both behind the thick, impenetrable cover of the grand staircase. The heavy marble instantly cut them off from the ballroom's brilliant light and the sniper's line of sight. They crashed against the cool stone wall, breathing heavily in the sudden, claustrophobic shadow. Before Jonathan could draw his weapon, the deafening sound of a suppressed gunshot echoed through the narrow space. The plaster on the wall just inches from Eleanor's head exploded into a cloud of white dust. Richard's men had already cut off the escape route. Jonathan grabbed Eleanor by the waist, shoving her forcefully behind his broad frame, drawing his Glock 19 in a single fluid motion. The waltz was over. The war had just begun. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the tight marble-lined alcove, but Jonathan's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. Before the plaster dust could even settle on the shoulders of Eleanor's emerald silk gown, Jonathan pivoted his Glock 19, raising with terrifying mechanical precision. He fired twice. The suppressed thwip-thwip of his weapon was barely audible over the roaring orchestra still playing in the ballroom behind them, but the results were brutally effective. The first of Richard's men, a hulking enforcer named Gregory, whose private rap sheet Jonathan knew by heart, crumpled to the floor, 2 hollow point rounds, buried deep in his sternum. "Move!" Jonathan commanded, his voice a guttural bark that brokered no argument. He grabbed Eleanor's hand, his long fingers interlacing with hers. Eleanor didn't freeze. For a woman who spent her life analyzing spreadsheets in the quiet, climate-controlled offices of the Mercer Syndicate, the visceral reality of blood pooling on white marble should have shattered her. Instead, the analytical engine of her brain shifted into overdrive. She kicked off her custom Christian Louboutin heels, leaving the thousands of dollars worth of footwear abandoned in the dust, and sprinted with him barefoot down the service corridor. Her body was heavy, soft, and powerful. She used her substantial weight to her advantage, throwing her solid shoulder against the heavy steel fire doors that stood between them, and the hotel's underbelly, bursting them open with a forceful shove that saved Jonathan precious seconds. "Take a left past the linens," Eleanor gasped, her bare feet slapping quietly against the linoleum. "The kitchen for the Perrine restaurant is dead ahead. They'll expect us to make for the underground garage, but we need to lose them in the service maze first." "How the hell do you know the layout of the Pierre's kitchens?" Jonathan asked, glancing behind them as they rounded a sharp corner. "Because I audited their supplier contracts 3 years ago, when we bought a controlling stake in their luxury imports." Eleanor shot back her chest, heaving the deep green silk of her dress clinging to the damp skin of her collarbones. "I know every exit, every blind spot, and every security camera in this building." They burst through a set of swinging double doors and entered the sprawling industrial kitchen of the Perrine. The air was thick with the scent of white truffles, searing filet mignon, and panicked adrenaline. A dozen sous-chefs and line cooks shrieked, scattering like frightened mice, as the ruthless syndicate boss and his gorgeous, imposing accountant stormed through their domain. "Down!" Jonathan roared as the kitchen door swung open behind them. He tackled Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her thick waist and pulling her down behind a massive stainless steel prep island. A barrage of bullets tore through the kitchen, shattering hanging copper pots, obliterating jars of imported caviar, and sending a spray of boiling stock across the tiled floor. Jonathan returned fire blindly over the counter, forcing their pursuers to duck. He pressed his back against the steel cabinets, breathing heavily, and looked down at Eleanor. She was wedged between his legs, her luxurious curves pressed intimately against his side. The sheer physicality of her presence was intoxicating. She wasn't trembling like a delicate, fragile socialite. She was breathing hard, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, brilliant defiance. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands hurriedly scanning her arms, his palms running down the thick, strong line of her hips to check for blood. "No," she whispered, catching his wrists to stop his frantic search. Her touch was warm, grounding his spiking adrenaline. "But we are trapped. Thomas and 2 others just walked in. They have the kitchen bottled up." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I have 7 rounds left. I can clear the right flank, but it's a suicide push." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I told you, Mercer. I always balance the books." She reached up her fingers, gripping the edge of the prep table, and pulled herself up into a low crouch. Her eyes darted toward a digital keypad mounted on the wall near the pantry, the central override for the kitchen's automated service elevators and emergency bulkheads. "Cover me for exactly 4 seconds, Eleanor said, her voice completely devoid of panic. Before Jonathan could object, she lunged. She moved with a surprising aggressive agility, her bare feet finding purchase on the slick stock-covered tiles. Jonathan instantly stood, unleashing a rapid volley of suppressing fire toward the swinging doors to keep Richard's men pinned down. Eleanor slammed her palm against the keypad. Her thick, manicured fingers flew across the digital numbers with the blinding speed of a woman who typed 140 words a minute. Beep, 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 buzz. An ear-piercing alarm suddenly blared through the kitchen. The heavy automated steel fire doors, designed to drop instantly in the event of a grease fire to smother the room, slammed down from the ceiling with a deafening crash, sealing the main entrance to the kitchen and completely cutting off Richard's men on the other side. Silence, save for the blaring alarm and the hiss of broken steam pipes, descended on the room. Eleanor leaned heavily against the wall, her auburn hair falling out of its elegant updo, framing her flushed, beautiful face. She looked at Jonathan, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her plush lips. "Access code overridden," she panted. Jonathan slowly lowered his weapon, his icy blue eyes locked onto her. He walked across the ruined kitchen, stepping over broken plates and spilled wine until he was standing mere inches from her. The height difference forced her to look up, but she didn't shrink back. She held her ground, her magnificent, full figure radiating power. He reached out his knuckles lightly, grazing the soft, pale curve of her cheek. "You aren't just an accountant, are you, Eleanor?" he murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, rough register that sent a shiver down her spine. "I protect your assets, Jonathan," she replied, her voice breathless, her dark eyes tracking the movement of his lips. "All of them." "Remind me to double your salary," he whispered before grabbing her hand once more. "Show me the way out." They bypassed the service elevators, which Eleanor correctly assumed Richard would be monitoring, and navigated the narrow subterranean maintenance shafts that ran beneath the luxury hotel. The air grew damp and cold, smelling of ancient concrete and iron, a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom above. The 61st Street loading dock. Eleanor instructed quietly as they descended a wrought-iron spiral staircase. "We can access the underground delivery tunnels. From there we can slip into the subway grid. Once we are in the 59th Street station crowd, we disappear." "Richard won't let it be that easy," Jonathan warned, his eyes scanning every shadow his gun leveled at the darkness. "He doesn't have a choice. By now the NYPD has swarmed the lobby. The mayor was upstairs. The police commissioner practically lives in his pocket. Richard's window for a quiet coup is officially closed." They reached the heavy reinforced doors of the underground loading dock. Jonathan pushed the door open, the rusted hinges groaning softly in the dim light. The cavernous space was empty. Concrete pillars lined the massive parking bays, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead. "Clear," Jonathan breathed, stepping out. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, boss." The voice echoed off the concrete, dripping with venomous satisfaction. Jonathan shoved Eleanor behind a thick concrete pillar and raised his weapon. Richard Davies stepped out from the shadows of a parked delivery truck. He wasn't alone. 2 more armed loyalists flanked him, their assault rifles leveled squarely at Jonathan's position. Richard looked disheveled, his bespoke suit ruined by sweat and desperation, but his eyes burned with the manic energy of a man who knew he had crossed the point of no return. "It's over, Jonathan," Richard called out, his voice echoing loudly. "Put the gun down. You survived the ballroom, but you can't survive this. Arthur Gallagher's men are waiting at both ends of the street above. The West Side Syndicate is taking over tonight." Jonathan's expression remained carved from ice. He didn't lower his weapon. "Gallagher, I should have known you didn't have the spine to orchestrate a hostile takeover by yourself, Richard. You're a parasite. You need a host." "I'm a pragmatist," Richard spat, taking a step forward. "You run this syndicate like a dinosaur mercer. You refuse to expand into the new narcotics routes. You leave millions on the table. Gallagher offered me a seat at the head of the table. All I have to do is deliver your head. And the 4.2 million you stole from the Caledonian bank accounts." Eleanor's voice rang out sharp and melodic as she stepped slightly out from behind the pillar. Richard's eyes narrowed, a sneer twisting his features. "Ah, the brilliant Miss Fitzgerald. I should have put a bullet in you the moment you started poking around the offshore ledgers. But it doesn't matter. The money is already transferred. It's sitting in an untraceable account in Zurich." "Is it?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head, a mockingly sweet smile playing on her lips. She stepped fully into the light, ignoring Jonathan's quiet hiss to stay back. She smoothed the ruined silk of her emerald dress over her wide hips, commanding the attention of every armed man in the room. "What are you talking about, you fat bitch?" Richard snarled, his patience evaporating. Jonathan's finger tightened on the trigger, a lethal, blinding fury erupting in his chest at the insult, but Eleanor simply laughed. It was a rich, dark sound that echoed beautifully in the garage. "I found your little embezzlement scheme 3 days ago, Richard." Eleanor said her tone conversational, as if she were delivering a quarterly earnings report. "Did you really think a forensic accountant of my caliber would just watch you move the money? I didn't just audit the accounts. I rerouted the routing numbers during the security patch." Richard froze, his face draining of color. "You're lying." "Check your phone," Eleanor challenged, crossing her arms over her chest. "Check the Zurich account. You'll find it empty. Because I took the $4.2 million and I wired it directly into Arthur Gallagher's legitimate front businesses, the construction firms on the West Side." Richard patted his pockets, frantically pulling out his encrypted smartphone. "But I didn't stop there," Eleanor continued, her voice hardening into steel. "I then anonymously flagged those exact construction firms to the IRS and the FBI for immediate investigation regarding massive, unexplained cash injections. The feds are raiding Gallagher's offices right now." The silence in the loading dock was absolute. "Gallagher doesn't have men waiting for you upstairs, Richard." Eleanor delivered the final devastating blow. "Gallagher is currently being arrested. You have no money. You have no backer. You have nothing." Richard stared at his phone, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his total destruction washed over him. He had been outplayed, outsmarted, and utterly ruined, not by the ruthless mafia boss, but by the quiet, heavy-set woman who sat in the corner office. In that split second of Richard's total psychological collapse, Jonathan moved. He stepped out from cover, firing twice in rapid succession. The 2 loyalists beside Richard dropped before they could even process the shift in the atmosphere. Richard looked up, his eyes wide with sudden terror, just as Jonathan walked right up to him. Jonathan grabbed Richard by the throat, slamming him back against the delivery truck. He pressed the hot barrel of his Glock directly beneath Richard's chin. "She is not a bitch," Jonathan whispered, his voice a demonic rasp. "She is a goddamn queen." He pulled the trigger. The echoing boom faded slowly, leaving only the distant muffled wail of police sirens from the streets above. Jonathan dropped the empty gun onto the concrete. He turned slowly, his chest rising and falling, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. He looked at Eleanor. She stood amidst the carnage, her emerald dress stained her bare feet, dusty, her auburn hair wild. She had never looked more beautiful. She had saved his life, secured his empire, and systematically dismantled his enemies without firing a single shot. Jonathan walked toward her, the space between them suddenly crackling with an entirely different kind of tension. He didn't stop until his chest brushed against hers. He reached down his large hands, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. "You routed the money to the feds," Jonathan said, a smirk finally breaking through his stoic mask. "You ruthless, beautiful genius." "I told you," Eleanor whispered, leaning up, her dark eyes heavy with desire. "I protect my assets." Jonathan crushed his lips to hers. The kiss was fierce, demanding, and born of blood and survival. Eleanor kissed him back, with equal ferocity, her arms wrapping around his broad shoulders, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. In the shadows of the subterranean concrete, surrounded by the remnants of a failed coup, the king of New York's underworld finally recognized his equal. She wasn't just his accountant anymore. She was the architect of his empire, the keeper of his ledgers, and the absolute ruler of his dark, unyielding heart. Did the heart-pounding tension and unexpected twists of Eleanor and Jonathan's deadly waltz leave you breathless? This is just the beginning of their dark, passionate empire. If you loved this thrilling dive into the ruthless world of the Mercer Syndicate, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more intense mafia stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a single lethal twist. Stay truly thrilling